Good day. My name is Dan Klein. I want to make a little presentation about reconsidering leftism, or maybe I should say a plea to reconsider leftism, making sense of left and right. I am a classical liberal. I particularly like Adam Smith. I think that Smith's sort of liberalism could be fashioned as conservative liberalism. Smith advocated a general disposition towards policy of, quote, allowing every man to pursue his own interest, his own way, upon the liberal plan of equality, liberty, and justice. And with that statement and numerous others, he and his friends christened the word liberal with a political meaning for the first time. So it's like a anti-governmentalization, small government, anti-governmentalization of social affairs, disposition, presumption. And that was the spine of liberalism, I would say, for then at least another 100 years, more than 100 years even perhaps, and still is in many parts of the world where the word liberal is used. And as we know, the word liberal took on other meanings later. But anyway, that's just to let you know where I'm coming from on this. I'm prompted to do this. I mean, I feel kind of impelled or prodded because I saw my good friend Brian Kaplan do a video on his theory. He calls it his simplistic theory of left and right. And I thought I would sort of pivot off his to develop mine. Like Brian, I kind of think we should try to describe or treat left and right as that the usage of those words is found. So it's not about making up our special preferred meaning so much as trying to understand what gets called that and has been called that in history. So I'm completely with Brian on that. Brian admirably calls it his simplistic theory, and it's as brief as this little set of slogans, set of short statements. The left is anti-market, the right is anti-left. Okay, if I were to make a similar, very short, the shortest I think I could do is the left is supportive of the left party. Now, I know that doesn't sound very satisfying as a definition because you're not supposed to use the word you're defining in the definition. But what if I said in the American context, the left is supportive of the Democratic Party and the Labor Party in Britain and so on? Then it's not like that. And so you kind of know what I mean. I mean, like we say here, like I said here, we are dealing with the word left and right as found in history. So getting reference to the world, experience is fair enough in terms of what we're trying to describe. So I hope you can forgive this, but this is why maybe it's not so simplistic and why it gets more complicated. And so anyway, and then the right is whatever the left regards as adversary. And so like Brian's here, I am defining the right in terms of a relationship with the left. So there's a lot of parallel, actually, between his take and my take, but I do want to be much more elaborate. And so we'll see how long this video takes, and I'm going to try to be really kind of brief and not elaborate these elements that I'm about to discuss. In other words, be really elemental and not try to persuade you of them either so much. In some sense, I'm only going to try to persuade you of the overall skeleton we put together at the end. And I'm going to do that by quoting extensively. And those are pretty much the only quotes I'm going to use extensively. from Marcel Gauchet, a quite eminent French scholar who's written on this topic. So, by the way, you might want to watch me at accelerated speed because I talk slowly, and look for links below. So the 5 elements, I just want to state them so you can get some warning. See here, 15. Engrams in English, engrams in French. Politics is directional. Politics is about lesser evil. The individual gloms onto a party. The party shapes his policy sentiments. The left pole, Hayek's two worlds hypothesis and Atavism thesis. Heteronomy, 4 observations about leftists: the long march, the government, the vicious tail, the Marcel Gauchet text that I want to look at a bit, and the whole matter of internationalization. Okay. So, as mentioned, I do think we want to make this historical, like make it clear what we're, well, first of all, know what we're trying to understand. And as you can see here in English, it's only since about 1920 that this got started. These are engrams for left wing and leftist. So for the Anglosphere, it's only, of the last 100 years or so that we're concerned with. And I think, broadly speaking, worldwide, this kind of terminology will, as we'll see from the French, is getting started like maybe around 1900 and thereafter, and picking up. So before 1920 in other parts of the world. So I think that international experience going back, let's say 140 years, is in some sense what we're theorizing. Here's right wing, and that you can see that too, starts up. Oh, here's right wing and left wing. Okay. Now I want you to notice something about this picture. Left wing starts before right wing, almost as though you need a left before you can have a right. That fits what we just said about right being defined in terms of a relationship with the left, because you can't define something if it's got a relationship to something which doesn't exist yet or was just recently created. So instead, the left leads the right, you see? And notice that both on Brian's and on my definitions of the right is more diversely, it's defined. It's defined in Brian's thing as anti-left. So anybody who's anti-left, they could be very diverse who are anti-left. I mean, if the left is a thing, Brian says it's anti-market. Anybody who's against that for whatever reasons could be quite different from each other. And similarly, in what I said, that the right is whatever the left finds as adversary, that too can be quite diverse. And so rightism isn't really a thing, you see, whereas leftism, which gets, again, started earlier and stays much, much bigger, is. Okay. So to the French, just so you know, this talk about the assembly going way back to the French Revolution and the right and the left, I don't think this picture is actually from about that. I think it's a couple decades later, if I'm not mistaken. But I just wanted to point out, just FYI, that it's right from this point of view. So you got the assembly here, and let's say you've got the king or the chief magistrate facing the assembly. It's on the king's right. So here's the right and here's the left, just so you know. But anyway, The engrams show us that it's pretty much the same thing in France as we saw in English. Like I said, it gets started a little earlier. There's this little bitty stuff going back, and this is like this is 1800 here, but it's minor and it's different. And so this is really, like I said, it's really this that we're talking about. So these are terms from French. A French friend of mine helped me with these. These are some more terms from French. I won't try to say them. But you can see that's the same thing here. It gets started in the latter part of the end of the 19th century. Yeah. Let's see here. Is this the same? No. Okay. And here again, it's the same kind of thing. Politique de gauche, politique de droit. And again, notice the gauche is the red one, and how it kind of starts first, and then you get a right that can be defined in relation to it. And again, it's actually lower. Okay, so that's a bit about the French engrams. Let me push forward here. Number 3 on our list of 15, the directionality of practical politics. Politics is directional. That's the point of here. So here's the status quo, and you can go in different directions from there. It's directional. And I give this example of US and Sweden to make the point that some people say that the moderates in Sweden are like the Democratic Party, because they're more or less agreeable to the current situation. And the current situation is a much higher tax load overall, and a larger welfare state. And so that's sort of like what the Democrats like, or would ideally want, or something. And the moderates seem to be, not at war with that anyway. They're more or less just accepting it. So the moderates are on the left, is the idea, is sort of the claim. And I don't buy that, because politics is directional. The moderates want to not increase the welfare state and the tax load, generally speaking. And the left does. And we each have different status quos, different points of reference, but politics is directional. If you took Bernie Sanders and he went over to Sweden and somehow became like a Swedish politician, it's not like he'd be a moderate. He'd be a lefty, of course, because it's directional. Politics is directional. Okay. Politics is about the lesser evil. You realize that people kind of, at least, they understand that. And at the end of the day, it's about a lesser evil, and it's about lesser evil among what options, and that's parties. Okay. And people tend to, decide about which is the lesser evil in a two-party system like the US, Republican or Democrat. I happen to think the Republicans are the lesser evil. Do I think the Republicans are good? No. We could talk about all sorts of evil things that we have to make a choice between, and it doesn't make the lesser evil good or great or terribly admirable. Just saying it's not as bad as the other one. So anyway, but people glom onto a party, and to a lot of people that becomes quite significant in their identity, and a influence, and the party shapes policy sentiments then, as people kind of pick a party or identify with a party. And there are a whole number of books that have said this. So here's one from 2004. and some information about it. You could pause your screen to read it if you like. Here's one from 2012. These are like top university presses, by the way. Here's one from 2017. And here's one from, I'm not sure when this came out now. I think it's quite recent, though, maybe the last 2 years or so, by Randy Holcomb, who's a friend of mine. Okay, so next I want to try to put in a video of Steven Pinker's. It's less than a minute, on the left pole. That's our next point. I hope Professor Pinker doesn't mind. But apologies if you do.
I think it's a disappointing and sad commentary that free speech has gotten the brand of a right-wing issue. Now, why should that be? There's no, by definition, it's just free speech, whether it's from the right or from the left. But people who defend and extol free speech, tend to be branded as right-wingers because of this. I think what you correctly identify as an ironic intolerance. I sometimes refer to the mythical place called the left pole. Now, just as when you're at the North Pole, all directions are south, the left pole is the mythical spot from which all directions are right. So any opinion that does not conform to this orthodoxy is branded a right-wing opinion, including people who are, by no stretch of the imagination, ideologues of any sort, including right-wing ideologues.
Okay, so yeah, that's I think a really lovely metaphor that helps us think about what I think Brian and I are driving at, in terms of a sort of geography, a nice analogy. Now, for this analogy, I do think it's important to think of just the northern hemisphere. One problem with invoking the globe and one of the poles is that you'll naturally think of the other pole at the other end of the globe. And the whole point here really is that it's not like that. It's not symmetric that way. Asymmetry is like the main theme of what I have to say today. Is asymmetry between left and right. So it's just the northern, and you've got the left pole at the top, and then anything far enough away from that so that it becomes adversarial is right. That's the idea. And you can think now of looking down from the top. And so, this DNC, CNN, et cetera, everyday Democrats are maybe going out. And then the left, the non-left, is all over here. Now I don't know what these other dimensions are here, so I'm not trying to chart things, but they can be very diverse, so yeah. And so if you look around the world, at least a lot of it, I think you'll find things that fit this kind of thing, just like the Dems in the United States as the left party. You'll notice that a lot of the imagery is red. Red is the traditional color of the left. The switch to the Democrats as the blue party came in the year 2000 from cable TV, I believe. I think especially CNN. Also, it's kind of interesting to see the similarity of the iconography here among quite a few of the left parties. So I'm interested in generalizing, not just about the US, but more broadly. I think Brian is too. Okay. And so here's another kind of where you could start filling in some of these non-left types, and they're not necessarily in great agreement. I mean, all sorts of other things you could put in here, whatever for some reason the left calls right or treats as adversarial. I guess now we could put in the patriarchs and the anti-thises and that's and whatever. Diversity. Okay. So I want to give a little bit of evidence of greater diversity on the non-left. aka right. And one thing is a 2003 survey I did, where I asked members of 6 scholarly associations like the American Economic Association and so on, support, oppose on 18 different issues, which were framed as government interventions. Do you support or oppose? So low scores are more pro-government, and high scores are more anti, opposing the government intervention. And these are the 18 issues, just so you know. There are a number here that, well, you get a diversity of interest. I mean, I'm not sure it's an unrepresentative or unfair, but the point is that on an awful lot of issues, and I think an awful lot of issues that are out there, regulatory state, nanny state, and so on, the left is quite party line-ish, as you can see here with the blue. I'm going back to our American convention here of blue for the Democrat. Is quite party line among the Democrats and more diverse among the Republicans. Okay, you can see that shows up a lot. All right. These are several of the 18. Here's the only one where it was kind of the reverse: government ownership of industrial enterprises. So in that case, the Republicans had more of a party line, but that was the only one where it was like that. Some of the other ones were just kind of like mixed on both, for both groups. And so anyhow, you can put all 18 together, and you can create for each person a score overall 18, and chart them in this space from basically 1 to 5, really, because there's no 0. And these colors are just by the different disciplines, so that's not pertinent here. And this is the Republicans' distribution of individual person scores over 18 issues. And now I'm going to show you the Democrats. Okay. And so what's the difference? There's 2 differences to point out. One is that the Democrats is more to the left, more pro-governmentalization. And secondly, it's more tightly packed together. It's less diverse. And you can just do this by adding up the standard deviations by question over the respondents for that question, for the Democrats, for the Republicans, and then just add up those 18 for each set, standard deviations. And you can see it's really quite significantly different. There's other research that I could point to. For example, this piece, I'll just read this. In both data sets, we found that liberals possessed a larger degree of agreement in their political attitudes than did conservatives. Here's another paper that looked at Tea Party five distinct ideologies, and mentions these 5, kind of suggesting that it's not a homogeneous group at all. And then here's a dissertation that by a guy named Christopher Cochran that is really of interest: left-right asymmetries, and it's cross-country. And he's saying that these different folks on the right do not agree. In multi-party systems with proportional representation, there's little multidimensional coherence on the right between parties on these dimensions. Let me read this one for you, finally. Clearly, mixed right-wing parties have to deal with the perennial threat of fragmentation, again, because they're diverse. Pragmatic pressures may be strong enough to push the party so close to the center that the ideologues in both camps, I just say 2 different camps of different parties there, defect from the party. In this scenario, the party ideologues may break off to form separate parties. This is less likely to occur in multidimensional left-wing parties where the lines of internal division pit ideologues against pragmatists rather than ideologues against other different ideologues. And so he's highlighting again greater diversity on the right, which fits our left pole analogy. And he's also pointing out that the right is essentially more coalitional. You know, if we go back to this circle, you know, these folks kind of have to be coalitional to get the lesser evil. If they consider the left a greater evil, they need to be coalitional, you know, to try to get the lesser evil across the finish line. So, and I think that's what this dissertation is also driving at. Okay, now the next big point, I mean, I'm not going to spend a lot of time with it, but it's a very central, important point. You know, Brian said the left is anti-market. I think it's a lot, there's a lot more to it than that. I mean, I know he knows that too, but that's one reason why I wouldn't quite put it so simply. I'm quite persuaded that Hayek really hit upon something when he said that modern collectivist politics was a kind of a reassertion of mentalities from our past, as it were, as a human species, you know, as a our ancestors 12,000 years ago were living in small bands, hunter-gatherer bands, 30 to 40 people figure, and society's not like that anymore, but our genes largely are. They've changed somewhat, but not that much. And we're still basically band man, if you will. And I believe, and Hayek and others have made this case, and Hayek was more properly getting it focused on the band rather than a tribe, which some earlier writers like Spencer and others, Popper, and so on, had used the word tribe. That modern collectivist politics, once we've got democratic nation states, a notion of social democracy, communications, kind of put forward the idea of the nation state, the top polity, as a band, as a we, and then taps into all of these instincts and penchants and mentalities that are so natural to us, and that really a lot of us, I think, rely on a great deal, and all of us, I think, rely on to some extent to find the world meaningful, and so forth, to find meaning and to think about things. I mean, I strongly believe in spirits, as it were. These are some of the works, these are the main works really that Hayek presented these ideas in. And so what he's saying is that collectivist politics in like that last 140 years that we're talking about, especially, which is when classical liberalism really started to break down rapidly, especially in terms of educating the younger generations going forward, that this whole new collectivist politics just surges and keeps coming and creates the horrors of the 20th century and so forth. And so that's his kind of his thesis about what's going on. I don't want to elaborate more, but I think it's totally important, okay, and true. It's large, you know, got a great deal of truth to it. It's by no means like the whole story about why people on the left think what they think, but or say what they say or do what they do. But I do think it's a super important part of the whole ecosystem, cultural system that they're part of and that we're all part of now, because we live so much now in that age. Just in terms of follow-up on this paper that I co-authored has at the start an explanation of Hayek's ideas. And so it pulls together a whole bunch of good quotes. So if you look at the first 10 pages of or so of that, you can read choice Hayek quotes about what I'm talking about here. Another thing you can do is this podcast I did on Band Man. The basic idea is we're not in the band anymore. And I elaborate that, and that might be useful. In terms of also stuff from me on this, believe me, there's many others, but you can see my papers and others and follow the sites. But for me, also chapters 8 and 11 of this book pertain. Okay. So I've said stuff about that before, so I'm not going to say more about it now. I just think it's super important. And I think it's something, when I think about my friend Brian, I think it's something that Brian ought to take much more on board. It fits being anti-market, but it's much more than that. It's a much richer and deeper human psychology, human meaning take on the whole thing, insight on the whole thing. Now, while I do think that band man thinking, tapping into the band man mentality plays a big role, as in Hayek's Atavism thesis about collectivist politics, it plays a huge role in getting people to vote for, what I think is the greater evil. I think there's an awful lot that's involved in what people say and do. And here I want to bring up this, just make this point about heteronomy. So heteronomy means what's the political subjection of a community to a ruler, to the rule of another power, or to an external law, the state of being beholden to external influences, the condition of being heteronomous. I want to think about this in a kind of individual, at the level of the individual, not at the political group level. And let me refer to Jonathan Haidt's metaphor of the rider and the elephant inside you, where your rider is your conscious self who likes to think he's steering the elephant. And then the elephant, actually has very much a will of its own and does things. And to a great extent, Haidt says people actually are rationalizing where the elephant is taking them, saying, oh yeah, that's where I intended to go and that's where it's good to go, when really the elephant is pushing its own way. See, that would be kind of, from the conscious rider point of view, quite heteronomous, where they're doing stuff they don't really control. I think the human ontology is totally elusive, so I don't want to settle with this rider elephant metaphor at all. But I do think it's useful, and just in terms of that metaphor, I think better state of mind, and so on, is where your rider and your elephant are more candid and more friends, and actually more in sync. And I guess your rider is more candid and honest about the powers of the elephant, and what the elephant's doing, of its force, and so on. And so that would be a more integrated kind of being, where the rider and the elephant are more friendly and coordinated with each other. And so that's one way to think about autonomy. Just more integrated is all I mean to say here. I don't want to do a lot with the word autonomy, and I know there's trouble in the word autonomy. I do not want to say that people are independent of all social forces or social influences or atomistic or anything like that. I'm an Adam Smith guy, so all moral judgment relates to a sympathy. So whatever moral judgment I develop, it's from social influences. I might be able to make myself independent of any one social influence, but I could never make myself independent of all social influence. That would be totally nonsensical. And indeed, social influences and the good of the whole is how you orient your whole ethics. So, but anyway, the point here, I want to come, Hannah Arendt has a couple of famous statements. One is that every generation we get invaded by barbarians, we call them our children. Another one, I don't have the exact words, but it's something like totalitarianism is not about getting people to embrace certain convictions. It's about destroying their ability to have convictions, to embrace any convictions. And that's like more where I'm driving here. And I just want to emphasize that I don't really think it's so much like wrong first principles. For example, like the Hayekian, atavism thesis first principles, like what Hayek would identify as the wrong first principles of an atavistic person today, that they therefore believe in and deduce from. To some extent, I just think that it's heteronomous and they don't have really convictions. And so we get all sorts of stuff that just play off of rather natural, innate, primitive instincts about a sense of exaltation of yourself among your peer groups in a very manifest way of your day-to-day life, wealth, security, prestige, status, and so on. And the state has all of its ways to do those things. So I'm not just saying it's about the atavism thesis, but you get this heteronomy, like I'm going to say here as we move on, partly because they do have an indulgence and an affection for the bandman thinkings. And so if people have a kind of an atavistic thing, like elephant inside of them, that deceives them a lot and leads them into denial and self-delusion and so on. If you just think of that as being high in somebody, that could be related, I want to suggest, to different things than about the person, which might make regularities about those people, the leftists. And, this is kind of conjectural. I'm not going to pile on evidence. Some of these do have evidence. But if you think about it, if you have a kind of atavistic elephant in you and a lot of denial and heteronomy, first of all, that atavistic elephant does help to explain that why leftists think and feel things that do spell the governmentalization of social affairs. So in other words, it explains why they would fancy leftism, why they would be attracted to leftism, along the lines of what Hayek said. So that's one. Another thing is that they're at odds with reality because we're not in the band anymore. So they've got this very powerful elephant that's basically like very much at odds with reality, and that creates heteronomy, okay? And that creates unhappiness. When you and your elephant, or let's say your rider and your elephant, because you're everything, when your rider's very deceived and foolish, you're not happy. You're more likely to be miserable. You're living under a sort of false quasi-religion. You could think of leftism as a quasi-religion. And by the way, I don't mean to be putting it down by calling it a quasi-religion. In some sense, I think my politics are a quasi-religion for me. but the point is it's false. The important word here is the put down here is false, not the quasi. And there is evidence about lefties being less happy, having more, these psychological disorders and so-called mental illnesses, et cetera, et cetera. Another thing is that if you have this band bent that's strong in you, and you're sort of not even really aware of it well, because of the heteronomy and denial and so on. In the band, there wasn't sharp distinctions between playing by the rules. And I mean, and when things came to the battle between factions or between bands, it was like all's fair in love and in war. I won't say in love and war, all's fair in war. And you wouldn't draw lines about what was fighting fairly. So you wouldn't have that as much compunction about fighting fair, playing fair. And you'd be more likely to have double standards and to resort to deception, cheating, lying, stealing, abusing power, weaponizing powers. So, and I do believe that there is a gap between left and non-left that way. I personally believe that. Whether there's evidence to point to particularly, I don't know. I'm not sure how good or whatever, but I'm throwing it out there. And then finally, if you have this atavistic elephant, you're very likely to be more political. You're more in the band. You were very conscious. You would be very conscious of being near the alpha male, as it were, the leaders. People were equal, but there was some pecking order. I mean, there was kind of a set of equals, actually, in a sense. But you would want favor from the leaders to eat first and so on. And you would want to rub shoulders with them, and you would be very concerned about your status and the formation of any factions or splits going on within the band, because everything's so much a matter of survival. So you'd be more attracted to being political. Okay. So, okay. Now the next idea, we got 5 left, is the Long March. And I think you know about that. Here's Mark Sidwell's book. He's British, so it's a little bit centered on Britain, but it's broad. And it's about the basically 20th century left discussion and plan to infiltrate the cultural institutions and to take over that way. And that fits in with them being more political, right? And if they're going to do so and then kind of have double standards, they can really work it. And I think that's what they did. And, look at how the left won the culture war and what to do about it. And so that's everywhere. I mean, there's pushback and there's alternatives, but the establishment and the traditional are, the universities and then the traditional media are left wing. So much is left wing, as you know, the press, and just so much is left wing. Okay. And also the government, and you could say the Long March extends to government, and that's fine, but I do want to also just single out the government. That's a central player, an ally now of the left, because I do believe that a lot of the people, most of the people in government lean left. You could call what we're talking, it's not even, you could, there's this, this concepts of the administrative state, the deep state, the swamp, the blob, and all those things. And I think that's a reality. And I think that's quite solidly left, or especially left. But there's also like just government employment in general. Now, just maybe most government employees just don't matter that much what their politics are. And it's really like what we really think of as people who make big pernicious decisions that matter a lot in the deep state, whatever you want to call it. But I do think that, you know, the left is very, very majority there, preponderant there. Why is that? Well, just a couple of social selection things would be like this guy said, people who are attracted to that kind of thing and believe in that kind of thing would be the ones who step forward for that job. People who don't like the governmentalization of social affairs won't be so attracted to it, and so on. And so he makes this point. And then there's the adaptation of people's beliefs once they get involved in government agencies and government employment. So there's that kind of plasticity of belief that also pushes them that way. I put together some of these ideas in this essay, which you could find online. But the point is that I think we know pretty well that the government now is basically a lefty operation to a great extent. I'm not saying, at least the central government in the countries that we're talking about, I'm not saying in every Republican state it's so much that way, or even that way at all. Maybe in Texas it's not that way. I don't know. Maybe in Florida it's not that way. I don't know. Although, you know, we know that schools, the K through 12 schools almost surely are, and so on. And that's huge. That's huge. Okay. So let me say that what I'm saying here, to be sadly blunt, is that this heteronomy and stuff actually means that, you know, it creates a lack of virtue, essentially. And you've got this tail that's lower down here in one of the sides as opposed to the other. Okay. And what I think's happened lately is that for various reasons, this vicious tail has wagged the lefty parties. Yeah. And it's really striking and sudden and sad just how far it's gone. I don't think it's you know, yeah, I don't think it's, I mean, I do think that I'm talking about something that goes back this 140 years, but just how much things have deteriorated and been, you know, turned vicious is striking lately. And, you know, why that is a lot of reasons. I do think that once you start really getting into serious perniciousness, you have dynamics that can push, you know, people have to double down on bad to kind of not be held accountable for being bad. And also, the more and more you insulate yourself from other people's ideas, or you stereotype and disparage and even criminalize other people's ideas, the more vulnerable you become to just like even basic challenges to your own thinking. And so you even more need to criminalize any kind of discourse or challenge. So it could be a very rapid breakdown of civilization, unfortunately. And yeah, unfortunately. Okay. So I want to turn now to this Gauchet piece from 1996. This guy's still alive. He's quite prominent. I don't know a lot about him. I asked some French guys, what do you think his politics are? And they said, like, he's not a lefty or just simply a lefty, as far as they know, that he's kind of classical liberal friendly. And this piece from 1996 is in English. Here's the citation here. You can see it's really quite long. But he's written more on this topic. Like here, this is actually 2001, this cover of his book. I haven't read this, but I'm gonna just pull from the 1996 article. And again, he's kind of treating left and right, looking all the way back. That is what he's doing. And again, just to remind you that this is really a since then phenomenon. And so really something happens here. And there's really two things, as we'll see, that happen that create what we're talking about, or bring about, that bring what we're talking about emerges. So I want to read these. I want to give you a picture of just how many it is. And I hope you can listen, because I think they're really quite good. And I'm giving you them because I think they confirm a lot of what I've been saying. Okay. So he starts off, back in 1789. But the story then moves forward, and that's when it really gets interesting later, to me anyway. It is not enough, therefore, to say that the revolution, that's, the French Revolution, created our favorite political categories. We must also say that it did its utmost to abolish them. This was not so much a beginning as a false start. Okay, so that's what he's saying. Like, we don't really see it happening here. He doesn't use engrams. They didn't have engrams when he published this, but the engrams beautifully fit everything he says. Okay, we're jumping ahead. We're starting to jump ahead here. Late 1800s, 1900. Things changed about 1900. Right and left would soon establish themselves as the terms for describing the two Frances that clashed so passionately. The change was already apparent in the 1902 elections, which saw the victory of none other than the Bloc de Gauche. From now on, no matter what was happening internally in terms of relations among the various constituents of right and left, the competition for votes would be played as a contest between right and left. And for this was the language of the voters even more than their representatives, hence the language the candidates were obliged to speak. The contrast with the ancien regime faded, and it became increasingly apparent that the crux of the conflict was the organization of society. So let me tell you what the two changes are. There was some of this right and left stuff, from earlier on with that picture of the assembly, but that was not that was about seating in the thing, and it had to do with, for example, attitudes about how much you supported the current government, the king, the ancien regime, or institutions of it, the Catholic Church. And it was what it was, and it would change through time. And political reporters who talked about what happened yesterday in the assembly, they would talk about different parts of the conversation, the dialogue, the hearings, and say, this part and that part. And it was about these representatives sitting there. It was not something that meant something as a political identity. It did not project itself outward in terms of, oh yeah, I'm for the guys who sit there and I identify with them. That doesn't come until here. Okay. And furthermore, so that's the one sort of change. The other big change is that it's no longer about this complex, whatever mixture of what went into how guys sat here or there in these years. It becomes leftism as we know it. Okay. And that's what he means here. The crux becomes the organization of society. So I'll pick up here. In this connection, the central fact was, of course, the emergence and growing power of the socialists. Its arrival was the crucial new factor that changed the rules of the political game. It was in relation to this development that other changes took on their full meaning. So this is when our last, 140-year period that we're theorizing about really starts, really emerges. And these words and these ways are happening, are a thing, really. Clearly, the appropriation of the terms right and left by the public went hand in hand with dissatisfaction with the way in which the words had been used. The terms were not simply transferred or extended from one domain to another, but redefined. These are the two things I just said. The extending from one domain to the other is just kind of like political reporting on what guys said in the assembly yesterday, to political identification, to organization of political thought, categorization, identity, meaning, quasi-religion. That's the extending from one domain to another. And then the redefining is, it becomes about collectivism, what Hayek is theorizing with the Atavism thesis. And then that array of parties that call themselves left, identify each other as left, call their opponents right, no matter what they are or like. And so that's the ball game from then on. And, because the lefties are so political and do journalism and so forth and become intellectuals so much and have kind of like the chatterers and the scribblers, and they're sticking their nose into everybody else's business kind of people, they kind of control the language. That's the important part of this whole in theory, is that they've had this big disproportionate setting of the language. That's also what Gauchet is saying here. And let me read on. Perhaps the clearest sign of the change is the shift in attitude on the right toward the term right, which was easily accepted through the 1890s, because it just meant like I was displaced in the assembly and what that means to the political reporter, only to be rejected for the most part after 1900. Not that the right had changed, only the sense and scope of the denomination, the right. It caused no difficulty as long as it referred only to a location in Parliament. There is a phrase from the 1890s that can be credited with a definite role in helping the new system to establish itself. This was a phrase among people on the left: no enemy on the left. This was the slogan of young reformers from the radical group who joined forces in 1894 and 95 to push for an alliance with the socialists. We have here the key to the asymmetry in the attitudes of right and left toward the existence of the right-left division. Clearly, the division was promoted by the left, while the right, which had little use for it, tended to deny its existence or refuse to acknowledge it. But, and this is, I think, the most important passage, this little one is the most important passage, for there to be a left, there must be a right. So if you've got the lefties declaring themselves left, and you've got the journalists and everybody going along with that, not everybody, but a lot of people going along with that, they're going to call the adversaries the right, whoever they may be. I mean, left, right. I mean, right. I mean, you can't have left, just like he says here. For there to be a left, there must be a right. And as much as you want to protest, and what are you going to do? Start not calling them the left when that's what they call themselves? Well, if you oppose the left, then it sounds like you're right, because right, left, like this way or that way. I mean, politics is directional. So what happened with the communists, this is now after 1936, was the same that had happened with the socialists before 1914. This is all France, Protest led to integration. The vehement insistence on separation ultimately reinforced the need for unity. again, at the end of the day, politics is about the lesser evil, and the folks on the left will lie and say, look, as much as like I think you're too middle of the road on these issues, you're too Fabian or whatever. If we don't pull together, politics is about the lesser evil. Those guys will win. That coalition will win, and that's worse. And so this is what happens. But they're just about like how radical to be, more or less. After 1936, once again, the left had the initiative in this process. See that once again, it would be artificial to proceed by symmetry with the right. It was on the left that the division between right and left was affirmed, underscored, and dramatized. Under pressure, the right set itself up as the party of resistance. Its reluctance even to call itself the right concealed an even stronger distaste for the antagonism. That is the big pitting between the two sides. Significantly, the right's campaign rhetoric was far more likely to denounce the left than to assert its own identity as right, or even simply to call itself by that name. Rather than promote itself, the right preferred to blacken the name of the opposition and to forecast disaster if the lefts should triumph. So again, they're coalitional, and they are saying we're the lesser evil. And this fits left pole. It fits my definition. It also fits Brian's about the right is anti-left. Okay. Finally, in short, while the left was at least mythically one, the right was in practice divided, just like Cochrane was saying. This derives in large part from the contrast between a symbolism of implicit unity and an irreducibly plural identity. See, if you're just the non-left and there's a left pole and it's the upper part of a hemisphere, of a globe, it's just a hemisphere, and it's they could be different in so many ways. And the things that get called right are different in many, many ways. So, all right. So finally, something should be said about internationalization and institutions that go beyond the national borders. I don't like to use the word global because it doesn't necessarily mean that there's no global polity and there's no global governance, really. There's no global sovereign. But so international institutions, I think they're very kind of most captured by the left and lefty. And of course, Facebook, Google, and so on. Plus, the media is more international, especially as more and more people read English. It's more integrated that way. So that's a change. That's a really big change. Social media, people reading your Facebook posts and so on all over the world. So that's just a big, important thing. But at the end of the day, there's still power, of course, at the national level and at the national government, and the national government is nominally led by elected officials, and they come from the parties. And so the clash between the left and the non-left in the political parties, the identification with those, or at least favor or disfavor among voter citizens, is still totally fundamental. And so I don't think the internationalization upsets, the whole theory at all. It's just makes it more complicated than it was perhaps 15 years ago or so. I mean, not that this was zero 15 years ago, but it's gotten so much more. So, concluding comment. I want to thank my friend Brian for his thoughts. I'll be very interested to know any thoughts he has about my thoughts. And again, I see a lot of confluence between his and mine. We both want to look at left and right, the terms, as actually found in history. And Brian's take was the left is anti-market. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, but I think it's not nearly fleshy enough if you want to get into really coheres in the left? What is the cohesiveness among those parties that call themselves left and recognize each other as left? When I say parties, I mean also across countries, because they are kind of allied and work together. And of course, they work with the Financial Times and the New York Times and the different everybody all over the, it's all a big network. And so there's something more to it than this. And if you put the left as this, it sounds too easy to say, therefore, the right is pro-market or is not anti-market. But the right can be people who are non-left can be anti-market. They can be horrible, right? They can be horrible too. As horrible as you think the left is, there are some who are non-left who are as horrible, okay? Perhaps. At least on average of the left horribleness. So this is a little difficult, I think, for Brian here. And then the right is anti-left. Yeah, that's okay. I mean, that kind of fits what I'm saying. It's the non-left. Yeah. Well, anyway, I hope this is of interest. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.